by Adam Hall. Chapter 14. You know what this is? The ring of steel pressed harder. Gun. I suppose he was testing me to see how far gone I was. Get a grip on that seat, he said. I could see the edge of it from where I was lying with my face still against the floor. I reached up and got a hold with my fingers below the cushion and realized that full consciousness was back in my head now, and my body was losing its numbness in the warmth of the compartment. I didn't know how much time had gone by since I dropped from the window, but it was probably a good 3 or 4 minutes. That was important, because this man was in a hurry to get me phased out in some way and shoved under the seat. Or he might rely on the gun and order me to sit beside him with the thing against my ribs and make some kind of plausible conversation when people went past along the corridor. We've had a rotten grain crop again, you know what that means, we'll have to buy it from those bloody Americans. I got it half right, and that was dangerous, because it left the gun flat against the side of my head, and if he pulled the trigger he'd probably blow my shoulder off, but at least I'd made a start, and he hadn't been ready for it. I'd swung my arm up in a sweeping forearm block, and that had paralyzed his wrist and got the muzzle of the gun away from my temple, but there was a lot to do yet if I wanted to survive, and I wasn't at all certain I could muster enough strength out of a half-frozen body. He wasn't saying anything, wasn't trying to warn me. I suppose he was enough of a pro to know that there wouldn't be any point in talking. The situation wasn't very complex, and he knew I understood that unless I could do something effective, I'd either finish up with my head blown off, or he'd pitch me out of the train and deal with things that way. We were in a lock at the moment, like 2 wrestlers. He was a strong man, and he was above me, and he had the gun, but the face of my sensei had come into my mind, and his image was floating there as he lent me his spirit, his ki, so that I was able to stop thinking about what had to be done and concentrate instead on how to do it, which moves to make, which muscle groups to call into action, which angles and surfaces and handholds would be best for me if I could find them and use them. There was, for instance, the strap of the window touching the fingers of my left hand, and I thought about it, picturing the inside of the compartment until I could identify the strap and decide whether it would help me. My arm was still across his throat, and his neck was arched back with his head against the door hinge, but I couldn't increase the pressure enough to block his windpipe, because he knew where the danger was. The throat is the primary killing area at close quarters for 3 very good reasons, and he knew what they were. I couldn't increase the pressure there, but I had to maintain it, because he was waiting for me to slacken off and lose the initiative, and then he would move his right hand and fix on the target again and squeeze his index finger and send a 200-grain hollow point projectile into my skull and through the soft gray convolutions of my brain at 1,500 feet per second, and I didn't want him to do that. He'd shut the inside door of the compartment after him when he'd come in here, and when the train hit the tunnel it slammed a gust of stinking air across us and blocked the eardrums as the tumult of the wheels built up against the tunnel wall and produced a long sustained roaring that shut down a certain degree of consciousness while the brain tried to accept what was going on and reassure the emotions. For the moment, I couldn't do anything but keep him where he was, and it wouldn't be long before muscle fatigue set in, and he made a move and caught me by surprise and finished me off, so I began trying to work something out, using the tactile data that was available. He had a choice, of course, and we both understood what it was. If he couldn't put a bullet somewhere conclusive, he would have to push me bodily off the train, and as I thought about it, I became gradually aware that the tactile information coming in confirmed it. He'd started to ease the pressure of the gun against my head and transfer it to my left arm. If he could break my arm, or paralyze it at the median or the radial nerve, it would release my fingers from the edge of the seat, and I would fall backwards through the open doorway, and he'd have time to put the bullet in to make sure. I began putting pressure the other way to see if I were right, and I was. He reacted at once, increasing his own. It was like a silent conversation going on, not terribly civil, but perfectly articulate. We were equally experienced at clinging to life, and there wasn't likely to be anything more than luck involved when we reached the conclusion. Meanwhile, Our two heads were within 12 inches of each other, and inside them there was going on this telepathic dialogue, so explicit that each of us had started anticipating the other's next move. The train was still in the tunnel, and I was shallow breathing again because the compartment was thick with smoke, and my eyes were streaming the whole time. The muscles in my right forearm were beginning to feel the fatigue of keeping up a constant pressure, and when I took it off and clawed for his eyes, we both shifted to the shock of the sudden movement, and I felt the gun swinging across my temple, and waited for the noise, and found my right arm free and smashed the elbow against his face, but missed and grazed his head, and felt the whole of my weight falling backwards until I found one of his eyes with my fingers and used a gouge and sent him hard against the seat as he tried to stop me. I thought he was screaming, but it was the locomotive. The sound came shrilling along the tunnel like a cry of pain. No go. I'd relieved the strain on my arm, but we were locked again, and the gun was pressed against my face with the barrel pointing downwards along my body, and it was only a matter of time before he fired and waited for blood loss and pushed me out of the train. He began hurrying now, and I knew why. If he could shoot me and push me out while we were still in the tunnel, he'd bring off a certain kill. It wouldn't matter if the shot didn't do anything lethal, because then, when I went down, I'd hit the wall and bounce back under the wheels, and that would be final. He was hurrying by millimeters, and I felt it, and gave it some thought, and realized that he wanted to make sure of a useful shot before he pulled the trigger. It was no good just putting it in my leg, because you can go on working for quite a long time unless there's an artery hit, and even then you can try for an overkill before the blood loss starts weakening the organism. So I began hurrying too, and pulled my arm from his neck and formed a half fist and went for the windpipe, but he was ready for any kind of move and blocked me, and then there was a rush of fetid air and the eardrums opened as the train ran clear of the tunnel, and I lost my balance and clawed for a grip on anything I could find, but it was no go, and I went pitching down to the track.